Hi, it's Dwyer. It's November 4th, 2025. GamblersAdvisory.com, a free site. BettingAngle.us, a free site. Let's talk about the cancellation. And I'm disappointed for a number of reasons. Of the Jake Paul Gervonta Davis fight. As premium subscribers here know, I thought that was a betting opportunity. I was on the Jake Paul side of the play. If you bet that fight early, you got better than a plus 150. All of us take the issue of domestic violence seriously, but let's look closer at this case, right? I think the cancellation's unfortunate. That's the side of the aisle I'm on. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, I might not have all the facts. In situations like this, the facts trickle out, right? I'm not sure if I have all the facts, but my understanding is that Gervonta Davis got sued in civil court for domestic violence, right? Civil court. And let's just say, folks, it's not a criminal investigation. Celebrities understand, especially celebrities looking at big paydays. They understand that people will come out of the woodwork. Some will file civil suits. The suit might be meritorious. It might not be meritorious. Folks, it hasn't been decided upon. It's a series of allegations, not proven facts. And Jake Paul decided that he had contractual grounds to cancel the event. Right? There was heavy risk on both sides. Jake Paul, much bigger than Gervonta Davis. Jake Paul was at risk, though, of losing to a much smaller man. Right? Can you make it back if you lose to a guy who weighs 55 pounds less than you? Right? How seriously are you going to be taken? Right? So there was risk on both sides. Maybe that risk became apparent as we got closer to the fight. Jake Paul runs his own company. That's a different dynamic. He's not an employee. He has relationships with sponsors. If the sponsors were up in arms, if enough sponsors said, hey, I don't want to be involved with this event, if Jake Paul felt that due to the politics involved, right, domestic violence, civil suit, he was endangering his company's long-term relationship with outfits like Netflix. If Netflix came to him and said, hey, we're concerned about this, whether or not Jake Paul was, then he would have an incentive to cancel the event. But I want everyone here to be upfront and to keep it real. Right? Whenever I start to talk to someone and they tell me that, they don't usually gamble, but they were thinking this time, I lose interest in the conversation. You're either a risk taker or you're not. Right? When I was first on YouTube, in fact, today, a lot of states don't allow sports betting. When I was first on YouTube, wow, talking about betting on boxing was dicey. Right? Everyone you knew bet on boxing. At least everyone I knew. But, people, the laws are the laws. And even though YouTube is global, many people, didn't want to look like they were participating in an unsavory, socially unacceptable market. Well, what I want people to understand is that there is no plausible deniability if you're a boxing fan. This sport was built on characters, many of whom came from, rough neighborhoods, or rumored to have been, on the wrong side of the law. Right? Understand, even Ray Robinson isn't Ray Robinson. He used somebody else's ID. That fighter's name was Ray Robinson. Right then, as he came up through the ranks, the press started calling him Sweet as Sugar. Right? But just understand, Ray Robinson is not Ray Robinson. You look deeply into Ray Robinson's background, there's even a part of his life where he was accused of deserting the army. Understand, a big moment in boxing, happened when two heavyweights fought each other. Back then, boxing was so dicey that the guys got arrested for holding a prize fight. So, the beaten fighter, heavyweight Jack Johnson, was talking to one of boxing's more significant figures, Joe Choinsky. Neither guy could afford bail. They were in prison, according to reports, a little bit more than 3 weeks. While they were in prison, Jack Johnson turned to the fighter who beat him and asked Choinsky what he did wrong. Choinsky was impressed with Johnson. Choinsky knew that Johnson was a great athlete who did some things in the ring well. So, folks, the guys spoke for 3 weeks. They even fought each other while in prison. They had exhibitions that people actually watched. Folks, it's after those 3+ weeks that Jack Johnson, a black fighter, at a time when, there had never been a official black heavyweight champion. We all know that people like Peter Jackson predate Jack Johnson, right? Johnson famously, after winning the title, goes to Jackson's gravesite. But just understand, folks, those 3 weeks in prison are as important to Jack Johnson's boxing career as any 3-week period was. Right? And Choinsky himself, 10 years older than Johnson, was a major fighter. Understand, Joe Louis had a felon in his corner. Right? You might not even know who Joe Louis really was, because of course Joe Louis was a stage name. Right? Louis has a colorful past. Sonny Liston had a fight with a cop. Right? The cop got injured. Liston ends up in prison. According to reports, strings were pulled. Right? Because Liston, black man in the South, fight with a white police officer, served less than a year. Right? Understand, Ali, of course, loses his title because of being a draft dodger, but what you need to know about Ali is that he hung out with some guys. Right? When he goes to fight for the heavyweight championship, understand, with him in Miami is one of my all-time favorite people, Sam Cooke. Look up how he died here online. Right? Sam Cooke, black entertainer, who started his own record label, early 60s. Right? I consider guys like that to be the biggest revolutionaries in life. Of course, with him was Malcolm X. Understand, Jim Brown, and there were allegations against Jim Brown in his life. Jim Brown was there. Right? Folks, Ali is hanging out with a revolutionary group. Now understand, at that time in the South, We're talking about Florida. Black men could not legally be with white women. Ali publicly was a black Muslim, right? He shouldn't be with white women regardless, according to black Muslim thinking, right? Well, there's a famous Jim Brown story. Ali's out with Jim Brown, right? Again, folks, just Google these figures. You have the technology, right? He's out with Jim Brown, and then Ali, they meet up with some women, and Ali disappears. So Jim Brown goes looking for his younger friend, right? And just to understand, when he runs into Ali, this is young Ali, right? This isn't even the Ali who shows up to a press conference with a woman who is not his wife while he's married. That happened in the 70s. When Jim Brown in the 60s, when interracial romance in Florida was illegal, catches up to Ali, Ali, of course, is at the hotel room in bed with several white women. Right, folks? You know, if you Google Jake LaMotta's past, if you realize, and I've made a video on this, that Rocky Marciano, his real manager was Frankie Carbo. Right? Please Google Frankie Carbo. If you look up Carlos Monzon's past, right, even before the tragic ending, you'll realize that, you know, some of the best fighters you know, right? Ray Robinson, who, you know, was accused of a few things, including domestic violence. Jack Johnson, Mann Act, Joe Louis, Sonny Liston. Folks, these are some of the best fighters in boxing history. So when I hear that an entrepreneur is involved in boxing history, right? Boxing ventures, and that's who Jake Paul is. And suddenly, in a sport where, you know, some of the guys learn to fight in prison, right? You know, Dwight Cowie is in the Hall of Fame, folks. Right? Some of the guys learned to fight in prison. They didn't even go looking for boxing. They were in prison, needed something to do, and there was a boxing set up. Right? When I hear anyone involved in boxing say, oh my goodness, this guy might be on the wrong side of the law, or might have been, or has, worse yet, been accused of being on the wrong side of the law, right? After you knew, before you signed the contract with the guy, that he'd been accused, may have even been convicted of things related to domestic violence. You knew that when you signed the contract. Now he's civilly sued for domestic violence, and that pulls the plug on the event. You know, folks, Ray Robinson was asked when he knew that a guy he was fighting was hurt. Right? The guy ultimately died. There was an investigation. And Robinson's response, to me, is the perfect response in the context of boxing. Robinson said, we're in the hurt business. Right, folks? You can't be involved in boxing and not realize that, you know, some of the fighters are from dodgy backgrounds. Right? Some of the fighters have made mistakes in the past. Right? You know, some of boxing's biggest moments happened while fighters were either on their way to prison, in prison, out of prison, disregarding the law, right? Being involved in orgies, right? I don't know what to say. I don't know how to talk to the person who thinks that boxing was always a Disneyland type of experience. Right? No, boxing is a back alley sport. Right? Boxing is a sport where many people get in boxing out of desperation. Right? They need to eat. They need to feed their families. Right? Ray Robinson wasn't even in love with boxing. Right? The sport accepts that. Right? Just, think it through. Sonny Liston talked about the mob. Understand, Sonny, when he, was in front of Congress and all this other stuff, it's not like Sonny disowned the mob. Right? Sonny, who famously said, the only thing my father gave me was a beating, openly acknowledged how the mob helped him when he was just a guy off the street. Right? So I'll just say, to me, it's a tragedy that the Jake Paul Gervonta Davis fight got canceled. Understand, I'm under no delusion. It's not like I considered Gervonta Davis to be a Boy Scout. Right? I'm under no delusion. You shouldn't be under any delusion. You see a boxing match and you need to realize that, hey, this is a sport where people come from different backgrounds. Where, you understand. In many cases, you're not watching a Boy Scout. Right? There's a promoter right now, great fighter. He was a great fighter, but I believe he privately knows he could have been a better fighter. Right? Because, of course, in his heyday, he was running around with self-employed models. There may have been a substance abuse problem in the background. He was running the streets as a young man. And that's a common story in boxing. Right? You're in your early 20s. To quote Jimi Hendrix, got this money and I don't know why. Right? Life is going to last forever. Right? Some of the greats had major drug problems. That's the story we're hearing now on Hector Camacho. Well, you have a boxing promoter who, of course, was filmed with self-employed models and stuff like that. Right? At a party where, there's cross-dressing and stuff like that. Most boxing fans look at the allegations and think, big deal. His life is his life. What a great left hook. What a warrior. Right? One of my favorite fights ever. You got to the last round of the fight. You thought, this is a jump ball. Somebody's got to make a move. And this fighter knocked down the other fighter. Big moment for me in boxing. Right? Of course, at the end of the fight, the boxing scorecards were wider than they should have been. But in the moment, you understood who this guy was. Jump ball fight. He needed to make a move. It's now or never. For that fighter, it was now. Well, understand, as you can imagine from time to time, critics of this promoter will say, hey, you're involved with self-employed models. Who cares about that? Not this gambler. Right? I mean, we can act outraged when we hear about civil lawsuits. I hope we're well past that point. I hope you understand when you look at some of these guys and you're hearing the guy was a draft dodger and all this other stuff, or you're hearing stories that This devout Muslim guy was actually involved in group sex with, you know, women of different races. I hope you just say, wow, what a great jab, though. Wow, that Cleveland Williams fight, that's one of the best heavyweight performances I've ever seen. Well, let's talk about who should replace Jake Paul. Not Jake Paul, Gervonta Davis. I know everyone's in Jake Paul's ear, as you could imagine. He is the CEO, right? He's the one who's the capital source for the business, right? This is not a guy following a promoter. This is the top shelf guy. He's the guy making decisions. Let me throw a name in the ring. He just had a fight. As I make this video, he is the EBU light heavyweight champion. This is a guy who, promoters need to think about this, right? Has one of the best nicknames in boxing. His name is Lyndon Arthur. They call him King Arthur. Right? Understand. Arthur, light heavyweight. Jake Paul, who really is a P.T. Barnum type figure, wants to have an advantage in his fights. Carefully picks opponents. Here, just understand that Jake Paul would have 20 pounds on Lyndon Arthur. Right? Understand, too. Arthur, who went the distance with Anthony Yarde twice. Arthur, who went the distance with Dimitri Bivol. In other words, you could sell the fight as, hey, you want to see me against a real fighter? I'm fighting the reigning EBU light heavyweight champion. Let me also point out, too, that I'm just a boxing observer. Right? I don't have any commercial tie-up with Lyndon Arthur. I'm not pubbing some fighter I know, have met, have talked to, represent in any way, shape, or form. I'm a boxing outsider. Right? I know some of you know that I represented a fighter at one point. That was a one-off. Right? I met the guy the day of the court hearing. So let me just say, Lyndon Arthur has been stopped before. Right? Jake Paul has an A-level straight right hand, as I've pointed out. Look at the Ben Askren fight. Right? It's an A-level punch. Right? Just understand, against Lyndon Arthur, a reigning EBU champion, a reigning regional champion. Right? Arthur has been down. Right? That second Anthony Yarde fight is a disaster for him. Right? Arthur can be physically roughed up in the pocket, has been. The Brian Suarez fight, you had a guy who threw volume at Arthur, who has one of the sport's best jabs. Right? But Arthur's a technician. Technicians sometimes can be roughhoused. Right? If you don't wait on a technician, and if you smother a technician, you might have success. Right? Castillo, Mayweather, the first fight. Right? So you would have a promotion where you could talk about fighting the EBU reigning champion. You could talk about the fact that this guy went the distance with Dimitri Bivol, beat Anthony Yarde. Right? Yarde, of course, is fighting David Benavidez in Benavidez' next fight. Jake Paul wants legitimacy with real fight fans. Right? The way to get it might be by fighting a current champion who's 20 pounds less than you, who got knocked down in his most recent fight. And when he got up, looked hurt. Right? Jake Paul, not only a great A-level straight right, but understand Jake Paul now has legs. He didn't have that early in his career. Right? The Jake Paul of the Nate Robinson fight no longer exists. Look at the Mike Tyson fight. I know people are looking at that Tyson fight and they're saying, oh, that couldn't have been a real fight. Right? Well, folks, focus on the foot speed. That's what determined that fight. Jake Paul's moving around the ring. Mike Tyson couldn't move with him. Lyndon Arthur, we're being hypercritical here, doesn't have the fastest feet. Arthur likes to have his feet set before he throws punches. A Dimitri Bivol, a mover, knew that he could move out of the way of Lyndon Arthur's shots. You don't have to get hit with that Arthur jab if you know how to move. So if Jake Paul wanted a credible opponent, he has one here. Right? In my eyes, there's not enough in it for Anthony Joshua to fight Jake Paul. Don't get me wrong, they'd make a lot of money. But Anthony Joshua is a heavyweight. Heavyweights age more slowly. Anthony Joshua is a blessed puncher. He only has to be right once. In other words, he could be fighting a superior fighter. Right? Let's take sides here. He could be fighting an Usyk, right, who's already fought twice. He could be fighting a Tyson Fury. He could fight a superior fighter. But the same way Francis Ngannou knocked down Tyson Fury, Joshua, if he landed, could knock down Tyson Fury. In other words, fighters like Joshua are only one punch away, literally one punch away, from putting themselves front and center in the lucrative heavyweight division. Right? So if I'm Joshua, I ask myself, do I want to endanger that future by fighting a novelty fight against Jake Paul? Right? Because sadly, the way life works is, you look at the career of Marvin Hagler, and one of the first things you remember is that fight against Ray Leonard, right? Not the Mugabe fight, not the Mustafa Hamsho fight, not some great fights that Hagler had, right? No, when you think of fighters, Ray Leonard, for example, you remember that first Roberto Duran fight, don't you? You remember the No Mas fight. You remember the Thomas Hearns fight. Folks, even with the greats, when you think of their career, you immediately remember, 3 to 5 fights that they had. The rest of the career was drowned out. So, Ali, right? Ali Liston. Ali Fraser. Ali Foreman. Right, folks? Ali had a lot of other fights. Right? So, Anthony Joshua, right now we remember Joshua Klitschko. Right? Understand, AJ's career is tied to Joe Parker's career because AJ gave Joe Parker his first loss in a unification match. If Joe Parker makes it all the way back, and he might, if Joe Parker becomes champion, that'll change how we look back on that AJ Joe Parker, fight. Right? Andy Ruiz. Right? That's a story of redemption. Right? AJ wins back the title. Usyk, 2 fights. Right? Why are we going to remember the Usyk fight? Because Usyk distinguished himself against Fury, against Dubois. Right? So if I'm Anthony Joshua, I think about, the risk involved in fighting a Jake Paul. Right? There would be a, how do you put it? Just like people remember Ali Larry Holmes, right? Which isn't a favorable memory for Ali. Right? And why that fight? Because Larry Holmes was a dominant heavyweight champion. Right? I'll flatly say he's one of the very best I've ever seen. Right? Well, understand. Jake Paul, AJ starts cautiously, you know that. Jake Paul would have the better legs than AJ. The first 3 rounds. If it's a 10-round fight, Just understand there's a possibility that just like Mike Tyson was caught flat-footed by Jake Paul, that Jake Paul builds up a lead on AJ, and then it becomes a matter of could AJ land big shots on Jake Paul, right? All I'm saying is, just like we learned, the Tyson Fury Francis Ngannou in his first boxing match fight had risks, right? Understand, I gave that fight to Fury because Fury won the last round. That's how close that fight was. Some didn't even give the fight to Fury, right? AJ could find himself in some kind of serious matchup like that with Jake Paul if he doesn't catch Jake Paul, right? For Lyndon Arthur, Arthur is a guy who boxing insiders know, right? The public doesn't know Arthur like the public knows AJ. There's less reputation to risk. Arthur also 34 years old, right? The risk for Arthur is that he's in a spectacular division, right? You just had Buatsi against Zach Parker. You have, Callum Smith, who was at that fight. You have Beterbiev. You have Bivol, future Hall of Famers, right? Benavidez is in that division. You have some sleepers. Vosdick is in that division. Lyndon Arthur might realize, hey, I have some big payday fights if I can keep winning in my division, right? Do I want to risk it fighting Jake Paul, where you'd get a lot of money, but you might lose credibility if that fight doesn't go your way at a time when you understand most of the public doesn't realize how good a fighter Jake Paul is. So do the Jake Paul people from this seat. Because of credibility, Lyndon Arthur is a reigning EBU champion. Because of marketing, right? King Arthur has gone the distance with Dimitri Bivol, with Anthony Yard, right? Because of the fact that Lyndon Arthur is a guy who can get knocked down, as we just saw in his last fight, early, against a young lion, and actually come back in the fight, win by decision, right? Because you understand, the Brian Suarez fight, Arthur's lucky to have won that fight. He was getting shelled, right? Jake Paul, if he needs to have an opponent who's credible and who's going to make a fight of it, is going to try to bring it for every round, right? Because this is the entertainment business. You want people paying for the event or watching the event to be entertained. You want outfits like Netflix to know, look, the opponent I picked was credible and tried to beat me for 10 rounds. Right? For all of those reasons, I think Lyndon Arthur would be the perfect opponent. Right? And you can entice him more than you can a heavyweight because heavyweights get paid. Look at the purses heavyweights are dealing with these days. Light heavyweights don't get paid like heavyweights. Let's not pretend that they do. Well, anyway, those are my thoughts. To sum up, folks, if you're squeamish about, participants having criminal records or accusations thrown at them, then you're following the wrong sport, because not only does that happen in boxing, but some of the fighters at the highest level have had problems in the past, right? You're 21, 22, you're from the streets, you got all this money, right? A guy can get himself into a lot of trouble, right? Secondarily, Jake Paul's looking for a new opponent. I believe it's a key moment for Jake Paul because Jake Paul has skills. Just beat Mike Tyson. A lot of eyes are on him, right? His Jake Paul-Mike Tyson fight got more viewers than Canelo Crawford, right? Keep the momentum. He needs a credible opponent, right? He could extend his brand to the United Kingdom if he picks Lyndon Arthur. Let me also say, too, that the problem with trying to pick a cruiserweight is that Gilberto Ramirez is coming off surgery, and besides that, Gilberto Ramirez is a future Hall of Famer. J.O. Pitaya is one of the best fighters in the sport. Chris Billum Smith just hits too damn hard, right? Billum Smith would be the puncher in a fight against Jake Paul. There's too much risk involved, right? The problem with heavyweights is Usyk, up from cruiser, was down on the canvas against Daniel Dubois. We can debate whether the punch was legal or not, but he's down on the canvas. Understand, Usyk himself has made 9 figures in multiple fights, right? The money's too great. If a Martin Bakole has a shot at the heavyweight title, why would he want to risk that? Even in front of 50 million eyes, 60 million eyes on Netflix, fighting Jake Paul, right? The economics is different for the heavyweight division. As I like to say here, there's the heavyweight champ, and then there's everyone else. Understand, Alexander Usyk is older than Jake Paul. I know the public views him as unbeatable. He's 38 years old, right? There is, other than Mayweather, Calzaghe, Marciano, there is an unbeaten champion in boxing, and that's Father Time. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.